To understand one of the social causes of the French Revolution, it's important to first go back in time to an age ranging anywhere from the 17th century to the early 19th century, known as the Age of Enlightenment. This was a period of intellectual and philosophical transformation that emphasized reason and science over tradition and blind faith. This age caused many to go against the status quo and seek answers to their many questions. One such person was Baron de Montesquieu. Baron de Montesquieu believed in the separation of church and state, and the separation of powers in the government. These ideas went against almost everything that France's absolute monarchy form of government stood for. These factors ultimately led to the unrest in the common folk and would plant the seeds for revolution. To understand some of the economic causes of the French Revolution, we must first get context. From 1700 to 1789, France's population increased by 70%. This created more competition for jobs, mainly for the lower class. This, coupled with a severe winter and drought in 1988, led to poor harvests, causing bread, the crop the lower class heavily relied on for food, to rise in price. This only caused more social unrest when contributed to the ideas of revolution. Another economic cause of the French Revolution was the drastic economic decline in France. This was caused by France's involving itself in many costly wars, including the American War and 7 Years' War, and many smaller skirmishes. In particular, the American Revolution crippled France's economy, because not only did France fight in the Revolution on the American side, losing ships and men, they also loaned money to the Americans, many of which would not be paid off until 1795. The political causes of the French Revolution tie back into both the economic and social causes of the French Revolution. This is because the common folk had grown discontent with King Louis XVI. One reason the common folk grew discontent with King Louis was because of his lavish spending. This spending included the building of the Palace of Versailles, a massive 271,206 square foot palace with over 2,000 rooms. In order to build this palace, it's estimated that King Louis XVI spent around $2 billion, which is around $4.4 billion today. Most of this money came from the unfair tax system used by France, which mainly taxed the lower class and nearly exempt the clergy and nobility. The Enlightenment also caused people to begin to question their place in the social hierarchy, which led to the unrest with how the country was being run. For context, in 1778, the Estates General, France's only form of government other than the king, it hadn't been summoned in over 135 years, was summoned to help deal with France's massive debt. The States General was comprised of all three estates. This might be good. You might think this is good, as the third estate now would have a voice. But the third estate had 98% of the population with 27 million people. But they only got one vote, as compared to the clergy with a population of 130 with one vote, and the nobility with a population of 350,000 with one vote. This means anytime the king or any member of the Estates General's upper two estates tried to raise taxes on the third estate, it would pass with a 2-to-1 vote. This led the third estate to create its own governmental body, called the National Assembly. Then, on the 20th of January, 1789, the National Assembly took the Tennis Court Oath, which said that the third estate would keep meeting until the king agreed to their terms. Although many members of the third estate just wanted equality and representation, some became radical, like the Jacobin Club, who removed the king altogether. This ultimately led to the French Revolution, truly kicking off on December 14th, 1789, with the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille was a fortress that served as a prison in France. To many, it symbolized royal tyranny. At the time, the Bastille was not very full, with only 7 prisoners inside, and not a lot of guards. So when an angry mob began forming at the front gates, many inside were nervous. The mob wanted the ammunition and gunpowder inside the Bastille, as well as the cannons removed to help fuel the revolution. As the mob got bigger, they eventually forced their way inside. This led to 98 attackers and 1 guard being killed, with 8 more to be killed after the initial fight. One of these men killed later was the head of the Bastille, Governor Delaunay. After Governor Delaunay was killed, the revolutionaries put his head on a pike. This ultimately led the National Assembly to become just as radical as the Jacobin Club, and it led to the severe violence later in the revolution. On October 5th, 1789, a mob of 10,000 or more members of the Third Estate, upset with still not having food in Paris, marched to King Louis XVI's palace in Versailles. Some of these protesters managed to break inside the palace and kill several members of the royal guard, and putting their heads on pikes as well. Once the mob got inside the king had no option but to address the crowd, and agreed to share power with the National Assembly, and to return to Paris. Seeing that the situation in France had gotten dire, the king attempted to flee the country, and retake it from the outside. So on the night of June 20th, 1791, the king's family disguised themselves as servants and headed towards Austria. But when the royal carriage stopped in a town of Vannes, the local postmaster recognized the king and his family, later returning them to Paris. Many saw this act and believed that the king was a traitor. Because of this, the new Constitution of 1791 removed the king of almost all his power. Although the king was now just a figurehead, groups like the Jacobin Club believed more should be done. This led to the radicals staging a protest on the Comte de Mars, calling for the king's removal. Due to this, the government of Paris feared an insurrection, which led to the Revolutionary National Guard firing on members of the revolution. It was a massacre. On the 10th of April, 1792, fighting between the National Guard and the King's Swiss Guard broke out, with casualties in the hundreds. King Louis fled and took refuge in the chamber of the National Assembly, where since the massacre at the Comte de Mars, the radical Jacobins Club had gained even more power. This led to a vote being held, and it was decided to suspend the monarchy. This is what I consider the end of the French Revolution. Although the king lost all his power, he was thrown into prison. This led to a major political consequence of the French Revolution. As more and more political enemies were thrown in prison, this led to a strong anti-revolutionary sentiment in these prisons. So when Prussia began invading France, the new democratic government in France feared the freeing of these political prisoners and the destruction of the democratic government, ordering the execution of all political prisoners. This led to the September Massacre of 1792, with over 1,600 victims, some of these being the king and the queen, ultimately starting the Reign of Terror. Economically, France had not recovered either, as all of France's outstanding debt was not paid, and the government's solution was to print more money, leading to higher inflation and ultimately higher costs. And lastly, the social unrest after the September massacres also made it possible for Napoleon's rise to power and making himself ruler, ultimately making so the revolution failed. But that's a story for another day. Thank you for listening.